Okay. Here it goes.
Good evening. I'm Michael Poppa, Executive Director of the Mainstream Coalition. Thank you for joining Mainstream Live, our series of conversations with figures in Kansas, politics, community building. Mainstream Live has been around for 30 years now, fighting for common sense government in Kansas. So if you'd like to learn more about how you can get involved, please visit mainstreamcoalition.org. And while you're there, make sure to register for Walk the Vote 2020. This year, we're planning a week of online advocacy, fun, and then followed by a virtual walk on Saturday, June 13th, all across Kansas. And now I'd like to welcome Kansas House Representative Brett Parker from District 29 to Mainstream Live. Representative Parker, how are you tonight?
Good. How are you doing, Michael?
Doing well, thanks. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here.
Excellent. So we have a lot to talk about tonight between the U.S. Court of Appeals yesterday and the governor's address this evening. But first, would love to know, how are you holding up?
I've been doing all right. When the legislature wrapped up several weeks ago, I self-isolated for a couple of weeks after being surrounded by so many people from all corners of the state. And then after quarantining, I actually have come to join my parents and help my mom out with my dad, who has Alzheimer's. So been doing a lot of constituent emails and phone calls, and yeah, good to spend some of this time with family as well.
Well, that's great. I'm glad to hear you can at least spend some time with family while helping them out. So let's jump in. Let's talk about the governor's address tonight. I had a huge problem trying to pull up the plan. Obviously, because I think everyone got on the site at once.
Yeah.
But we saw a pivot tonight from flattening the curve, I think, to boxing in the virus.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're only able to move forward with some really strategic reopening plans because Kansas did such a good job of flattening the curve. Secretary Norman talked about how we actually were spot on the projections for what we could do if we took responsible measures on social distancing and staying at home. So, now it's trying to figure out, how do we do life? How do we let businesses do business for the time being while we hopefully work towards a vaccine and more permanent solutions? So I appreciate kind of the measured, targeted approach they're taking, that there's pretty common sense guidelines to hopefully give us the best chance of reopening safely in a sustainable way.
Definitely. And I know Governor Kelly kept referring to it as the framework as a living document.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's not a playbook. I mean, we're learning this from other countries, we're learning this from other states, but it's there are certainly things that I think as an entire nation we could have done to be more generally prepared. But this particular situation is one unique really to this past almost 100 years. And thankfully we have some tools to combat the virus from a public health perspective and to try and get businesses as much as possible up on their feet as we try and navigate this uncertain time.
Right. Well, and as you mentioned, I think we're in the position that we are in right now because we acted so swiftly. Governor Kelly, Dr. Norman acted very swiftly. And now it seems, rightfully so, it's going to be a gradual phase. Governor Kelly even said or stated that COVID-19 is going to be around for a while. And we don't know if we're ever going to get back to the normal we were before COVID, before this pandemic.
Yeah, and I think that highlights too, one of the important things about this new plan is that it gives some flexibility for individual communities around the state to react to their situation. In Johnson County, I believe our stay-at-home order is extended through May 10th. So that makes a little bit more sense in a more highly concentrated population area. You might have a little bit more flexibility and just go purely with the state guidelines if you're a less populated county where there's some just natural spacing to begin with. So And I think that's probably going to be a moving target for each of those communities as well. I mean, thankfully we're ramping up the testing capacity, and there's a plan in place for contact tracing. But you might have an outburst in one county, and that county may have to up their restrictions. But if we can isolate it and track it, maybe that means that the rest of the state can keep going about business as close to usual as we can safely do.
And this will have long-lasting, long-reaching implications, especially this year on voting. And I know you're a huge voting rights advocate. Let's talk about yesterday. The U.S. Appeals Court affirmed that the Kansas law requiring a birth certificate to register to vote is unconstitutional. So in the past, I believe that you've tried to repeal that law yourself in the State House.
Yeah, one of the first pieces of legislation that I worked on, or in my first term, was a bipartisan voting rights bill that would have repealed the unconstitutional Chris Kobach policy and implemented a couple of other things to make it easier to vote, an election day registration policy, permanent advance ballots for those who want it. But that's been stopped by far right leadership at every turn. In fact, that was kind of the main crux of their set of postcards against me in the last election, was trying to defend that law and paint repeal as a bad thing, when in reality, I think glad the courts upheld this, that all we are trying to do is uphold the Constitution in Kansas and make sure that people have that right to participate upheld and protected.
Great. Applaud you for that effort. Thank you. You mentioned same day registration. I know there's a push again this year by a few legislators and some advocacy groups to maybe bring that back into the forefront.
Yeah.
Tell us a little more about that.
We had a big fight on it. Well, that fight's not the right term. We had a great committee hearing last year in the House, and I'm grateful. Even the chairman, who I don't think really supports the policy, was willing to give it a full hearing. We had great testimony, and then we got to vote on the bill in committee, but on a nearly party line vote after overwhelmingly positive testimony for it, it went down in the House. The Senate had a bill come forward from the Republican vice chair this year on their elections committee. And I think it was kind of drafted along what some of the county clerks have been looking for, which is just a way to make more provisional ballots count. So this is not same day registration, but it's in the ballpark, and I think would just be a common sense policy that would alleviate a lot of the problems, which is when people register to vote on election day, they actually are allowed to register to vote that day, and then they're given a provisional ballot to cast. They just don't count the ballot. But this is someone who otherwise is verified as a voter. They're registered. They are a legal voter for all subsequent elections, so long as that everything checks out for them. Between that group of people and those who have moved from one county to another, who are already verified voters in the state of Kansas, maybe they even registered under the unconstitutionally restrictive, Chris Kobach legislation, but they moved from Douglas County to Johnson County, or from Johnson County to Wyandotte County. They do the same thing. They update their voter registration on election day, but their provisional ballot that they vote doesn't count. Strangely, if you move within a county, you're allowed to do that, and they count your votes on like races. So anyway, between those two pools, that's 80% plus of the provisional ballots that get thrown away. So the Senate had a really good discussion around it. I think it actually passed out of their House committee, but then didn't advance when it got to the Senate floor. So I think a lot of it's just an education process. I think the more that legislators hear from otherwise eligible voters in their districts whose ballots are being thrown out because of these kind of arbitrary rules, I think the more willingness there will be to, one way or another, enact more common sense policies that will make sure we're not throwing away provisional ballots from otherwise qualified electors.
Do you think the ruling yesterday or the affirmation would then pave the way for something like that? Could it?
I would like to say so, but I think I don't want to get too optimistic on that front. Right now, I'm glad that that has been decided by the courts. We don't have to revisit it in legislation. It had been temporarily struck down by a lower court, so that law wasn't functional. But it's nice to just have that case closed once and for all. And really, in their ruling, they talked about how that law had the opposite effect that they tried to advertise it as. It made our elections less reliable because you were cutting out some 30,000 plus Kansans who should have been registered to vote. And we have close elections in Kansas. We had there was a Merriam City Council race about 3 years ago that I think was 2 votes on election night. It may have gotten a little bit more spread out after that. We had a gubernatorial primary that was decided by 300 votes. I mean, this law very well may have affected who the Republican nominee was, because the difficult thing with limiting voter registration is it doesn't just affect one election. It has the potential to affect many elections down the road if those people who are denied don't otherwise find a way to get registered.
So what do you think about Johnson County automatically mailing advanced ballot applications out? I know Sedgwick County does it, Wyandotte County does it. I'm sure there are others.
Yeah, I love it. I think it's a great plan. I think voters are really going to like it. When I've knocked doors for the past couple election cycles, I talked with a lot of voters who that's just how they like to vote in normal circumstances. The great upside of it is you're one of the first people to get the ballot. You can look up races that you forgot were on the ballot that year. You can find organizations like Mainstream Coalition or others, that you trust for guidance on who to vote for. And then you drop it in the mail. You get to do it all from your living room. You take your time. And even if you like the voting in person experience, you can still have the ballot mailed to you, take your time, fill it out, and go into your polling place or to an advanced voting location and drop it off and get your sticker and, be a part of the experience that is voting on election day or at a polling place. So I think it's a great idea, especially in these times. I mean, we watched just the tragedy that was the Wisconsin primary election unfold. Now they've traced, I think, close to 3 dozen cases of COVID-19 to people who probably contracted it by being out on election day. We're hopeful that things are in a better place this August for the primary and in November for the general. But I think it's just prudent to be ready and provide a really convenient alternative method to make sure that everyone who's eligible to vote has an opportunity without endangering themselves, without endangering poll workers. And that may be a real challenge for the county and all the counties around the state, is finding poll workers to work election days for in-person locations.
Right. The Democratic primary this year, it is all mail only. So they closed down any polling locations, and it was all vote by mail. Did you hear of, because it's been ongoing? I know it's
right.
Technically Saturday. Is that correct? Technically Saturday is the last day.
Second, yes, the Saturday.
Okay. Have you heard of any logistical problems with that? I feel it's been pretty successful so far.
Yeah, I think on the whole, it's been a giant success. Anytime you move from a caucus to a primary, you're going to get radically increased turnout, which is the point. And I applaud the party for taking that step. Because most states that do a primary for their presidential, it's a state-run primary. Like the Wisconsin one we were just talking about is the equivalent of our August primary. They just do it earlier and the presidential races are on the ballot. This is something that the Democratic Party in Kansas took on their own and was able to administer thus far pretty smoothly. I think the ideal, even in a time like this, would be to have still some in-person polling locations, but May 2nd is still going to be under a stay-at-home order. It was pretty near what we thought the peak was going to be, at least for our current stage in the coronavirus. So in this case, I think it made a lot of sense to go entirely to mail. If we're, approaching a really difficult public health situation for August and November and really have to move towards primarily mail balloting, I think if you can do it safely, the ideal is still to have some in-person polling places. because not everyone gets easy access to mail if they've moved recently, if they've updated their voter registration. There are a few quirks to it, but I think it's the best of all worlds when you can combine those methods.
Right, and one of the quirks you just mentioned, there are a couple of quirks, especially with mailing out the application. So the county mailing out the applications. A voter is deemed inactive in the system after skipping 2 federal elections. So they won't be mailed the ballot. Do you know about that? Do you know much about that?
Yeah, well, I saw that Johnson County is using the criteria. I wasn't sure the exact one. That is limiting in some regards. It's gonna be a blunt instrument at not wasting paper, right? Because there are people who were registered in Kansas, moved across state line, are now properly registered in Missouri, will only vote in Missouri. But most people when they move don't think to cancel their previous voter registration. So there are going to be some cases like that, and that's a way to catch people in that boat. But if someone is in that category but still a registered Kansas voter and a Kansas resident, I encourage them. They can go online and request their mail ballot through the Johnson County Election Office or through ksvotes.org. And both of those now allow you to request it just on your smartphone, sign with your finger. So hopefully we're able to get word out to people who might fall into that crack and get them signed up as well.
Right, and I know on KS, because I did it on ksvotes.org, you can go on and request both at the same time.
Yeah, I love that. That's what I did.
Signatures, it's great.
I didn't even realize that was the feature until last year. I went to request for the local elections my primary ballot, and all I had to do was check a box for November, and I was good to go. So yeah, right. I'm a big fan of that.
Much easier. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about education. We talked about voting during this pandemic and what that might look like. We heard Governor Kelly talk about graduations still being off this year, not necessarily knowing what's going to happen in the fall. You're a teacher. You're not teaching this year. Is that correct?
Right. I'm on leave.
You're on leave. What have you heard? What do you think is going to happen? I know that's a pretty broad, open question. What do you think is going to happen, Representative Park?
Yeah, it's a poor time to be in the prediction business. A couple of things, though, I think we can say is, one, Kansas is really fortunate that Governor Kelly took really proactive action by moving the entire rest of the school year for this year to online education. And I heard a lot of people push back on that early on because they were saying, well, let's wait and see a couple of weeks. But what you do to your students and your teachers and that is just leave them in limbo. You can't design an entire online education system that might last 2 weeks, but might last 2 months and do it responsibly. And it's hard to get buy-in to build that system and implement it. So thankfully, Kansas, right around spring break for most districts, was able to quickly pull in some really bright minds of educators and education specialists around the state, put together statewide guidelines, and then empower the local districts to really go out and build their own programs. I also think we've seen it makes a big difference for districts that really brought their teachers themselves into that process of building that program. Olathe School District, which is where I've been teaching, is one that did a nice job with that, and I've been hearing mostly positive feedback. Obviously, doing a change of that magnitude is stressful on everyone. Sure, it's not shocking to anyone that teachers are, working even more hours to try and make it work for their students, and we're grateful for all of those efforts. Moving forward, I think the fact that Kansas was able to put a lot of that in place this year puts us on better footing if we should have to revisit that at some point in the next school year. I think everyone's hopeful that we can, with some accommodations, facilitate in-person education come August. But, like the governor talked about in her speech tonight, we're not rushing ahead on any of these things. They're going to be dictated by what can be done safely for all Kansans. And so we hope we can go back to an in-person system as soon as possible. But thankfully, we really have a leg up and have been a model for a lot of other states around the country. And a lot of our districts have become models for districts around the country.
Yeah, I just read yesterday or the day before that Johnson County Community College announced that they're giving guidance to all their instructors to prepare for an almost completely online fall semester.
Right.
And as you mentioned, they'll, at least for higher ed, they're going to have some classes still on campus, but it'll be very few and far between, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, really one of the giant challenges across all different aspects of life is trying to get the best possible balance that we can. Online education is not a substitute for what teachers do day in and day out in the classrooms. There are all sorts of new problems created by moving to that system. You have students who have, limited or no access to internet. That's obviously a giant factor, but even it also just exacerbates the challenges of students who have, parents who are going to take an active role in monitoring their progress and being a part of that. And you have a lot of parents who are in difficult situations financially right now who may not have the capacity to also be the supervisor of their, student school work 7 hours a day. So I'm glad that we put into place the best accommodations that we can. I think everyone's also eager though to get back to as close to, normal school life and as we can do safely.
Sure. So you had mentioned earlier that you were, among other things, responding to constituent emails and phone calls. What are you hearing most about right now?
The most common right now is navigating unemployment in Kansas, and this is not unique to Kansas in having a surge like we've never seen in claims. Unfortunately, Kansas is dealing with kind of uniquely old IT infrastructure. And this is well before my time in the legislature, but I think all of us have probably gotten a decent history lesson we never thought we needed on the Department of Labor. They had a modernization program that was underway and then got scrapped about halfway through in 2011 and not really revisited. So you had a decent amount of money invested without really getting the end result, which would have been a much more modern, capable IT system for our Department of Labor. So really the department is having to deal with a few layers of crisis, one on top of the other. One is just that the number of people applying is massive. So the website is not normally, suited to deal with that. And same thing with phone calls. You don't want to staff that department for 100 years waiting for a 100-year pandemic, situation. So you have 99% of your staff without something to do for most of that time. So scaling up the ability on that. Then there's great federal legislation that helped with this, right? There's an extra $600 a week for people on unemployment. Those who wouldn't otherwise be eligible for unemployment can still be eligible for the federal aid. But now you're asking each and every individual state, while they're dealing with this surge of people trying to access their regular system, to build an entire new program to distribute funds to people who were never eligible before under their program. So it's an IT nightmare. I'm so grateful for all of the staff in that department who are just putting in insane hours trying to process as many claims as possible, trying to upgrade the website, and again, trying to build an entirely new program to distribute funds to gig economy workers, to self-employed people who were never a part of the unemployment system before. So it's a lot.
And they're essentially working 24 hours.
Yeah, right. And I think this is a place where people who are struggling with this probably really notice when they have an active state or state senator, and this is not a partisan thing. There are people who I ideologically disagree with, but who are doing a great job being, constituent service right now. We're able to help kind of triage a lot of that if people reach out to us. At this point, I know some of the common reasons for things not going through on the website and can give quick answers, in an email a few hours later or the next day to someone who might otherwise just be hitting a wall on the website. And for cases that are truly unique and need specialized attention, we're able to kind of serve as an extra layer of customer service and flag those for the real experts at the Department of Labor. So there's a lot that goes into it. It makes me, it reminds you what a privilege it is to serve in this role and get to really do something tangible to help people in a time of need.
Thank you. Thank you for serving. How can people get a hold of you if they do have questions?
Yeah, the best way right now to get answers, especially around unemployment, is just to send an email to me or their state legislator. I know Mainstream has a nice ksledgelookup.org tool.
Got it.
But also, if I'm your state rep or you just need someone to reach out to, my legislative email is Brett with 2 T's .parker@house.ks.gov. It's all also on the Kansas Legislature website. You can find all of us on there and our contact information. But really, phone calls are great. Happy to take all the calls we can and talk with people over the phone. But really getting action on things, the easiest is to just write up, here's their situation, here's what they've tried, here's what hasn't worked, put the name and contact information, and then that makes it simple for me to reach out to the department and flag if it's a unique case and get the latest update on what's going on with them.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Is there anything else that you would like to let us know about or leave us with any words of wisdom?
When you get your advanced ballot applications in the mail, fill them out, send them back. You're not just doing a favor to yourself and making a more convenient voting process for you, but you're also doing a tremendous gift to our great county staff and election day poll workers by taking a lot of the burden off of them for trying to figure out how to deal with presidential level turnout in the midst of a global public health crisis. So one of the best things you can do to make sure your vote counts and to help all of those people working overtime to make this happen is to fill out your application and vote by mail.
Well said, sir. Thank you. And thank you so much for being with us tonight. We really appreciate your service and your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Hey, you're welcome. Anytime. And thank you everyone for joining in tonight's discussion. Please visit mainstreamcoalition.org to view upcoming events like Walk the Vote, sign up for action alerts, and learn how you can help to make change in Kansas. This is a critical election this year, probably the most important one of our lifetimes. So make sure you cast your ballots and then make sure, as Representative Parker said, that you do more than vote. Thank you.